Hey, welcome. Today we're going to be looking at a united body of action, progressivism, and the early 20th century United States. As we go through, we want to understand the political and social forces that transformed politics at the turn of the 20th century. We want to examine President Theodore Roosevelt as an example of a progressive politician, analyze the election of 1912, and study the roots of 20th century environmentalism. Now we're going to start the material with an engagement exercise. We want to watch the primary source, Keep America Beautiful. Remember, a primary source can be a document, an article of clothing, an item, a painting, any object created during a time period we're looking at that we use as evidence, as a voice from the past. So this is a commercial called Keep America Beautiful. And we want to answer the following questions, and I will warn you that one of these is a trick question. So, when do you think it was made? What is the message? Why use a Native American? What is its significance to history? And what is your personal reaction to it?
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country. And some people don't. People start pollution. People can stop it.
So, when do you think it was made? Well, it was made in 1971. Which, when we look at the contemporary environmental movement, this was really the roots of it. So I'm emphasized here contemporary because, as we'll see, environmentalism, environmental policy is not something necessarily new. What is the message? Basically, recycle, don't litter, protect the environment. Why use a Native American to send the message? Well, here's the trick question. They didn't. Iron Eyes Cody was an Italian-American actor. He was part of a tradition in Hollywood during this time period, and in fact, really going all the way back to the beginning of motion pictures, especially what they called talkies back then, and motion pictures with audio. And what they would do is they would take someone who was not a Native American, usually use red face paint, cosmetic makeup, and then dress them up in what was considered to be quote-unquote traditional Native fashion. Of course, the type of clothing that they usually used was styled after Plains Native American tribes or nations, and would not have been found in many places in the eastern woodlands, especially far north, in the Great Basin region, Southwest Plains, out in California, so something very unique to the Great Plains. And why did they use them? Well, during this time period, we usually used Native Americans because they were seen as the perfect environmentalists. Now, today we understand that this is not necessarily the case. Did Native Americans practice what we call homeostasis, a perfect balance with their environment? No, not necessarily. Many of them did try to maintain or preserve their resources, but we do have evidence of some Native societies straining their resources. So the perfect example of this would be the Mayan culture, which overfarmed in some of the mountainous regions of Central America. They cut down too much of the forest land that kept the soil rooted. Didn't always practice terracing when they were making their fields as population pressures mounted. And in the end, we understand that erosion and landslides were part of an environmental issue that they faced that, when compounded with climate change, population pressures, economic problems, and warfare, led to the erosion of their power as a major political group. Now, what is the significance of this video to history? Historians can use it to study environmentalism, ethnicity, and their intersections. So, what were environmentalists trying to do in the 1970s and 80s? How did they use representations, or in this case, shall we say, misrepresentations of ethnic groups to get their message across? The personal reaction to it will, of course, vary by who is watching it. But in this time period, it worked well. It was an effective commercial. Westerns were, really big in this time period. There was a newfound appreciation of Native cultures in academia and in popular society during this time period, especially as a result of Native American movements to revitalize their cultures. So back then, it was considered a very effective commercial. Of course, now, in the wake of Black Lives Matter, in the wake of recent immigration reform movements, a number of other social movements, especially in the United States, this commercial would have issues, especially given the way that they portrayed Native Americans. It would pretty much be considered a very racist commercial today. But today we're going to be taking a look at the roots of this early environmentalism. So just kind of something to kind of get our minds flowing as we get into the material. Now, today's topic is progressivism. Progressivism is something that you've probably heard about in modern politics. Today, we have groups of progressives, usually connected to the Democratic Party, that push for equal rights for women, reproductive rights for women, reform of the criminal justice system, especially in regards to the way it treats minorities. Progressives today focus on environmental issues, climate issues, a number of different topics. But again, usually when you use the term progressive, it's connected to the Democratic Party. Now, progressivism was a movement also in the early 20th century. And the notion of political reform central to the progressive era, the first 2 decades of the 20th century, when urban reformers with a faith in progress sought to address local and national social problems through political and civic means. This was a dominant kind of current within politics during the time period. And progressives in the early 20th century could be either Republican or Democrat. So they were not necessarily tied to one singular party. Now, who were progressives? They were intellectuals. They were members of both parties, usually middle class. They labeled themselves humanitarians, what we would consider philanthropists today. And there were, of course, some affluent members of this movement whose names carried national weight, so very wealthy people. And again, this isn't something that's new. Some of the progressives, people that we would link to some of the progressive causes today in society would be, household names like Gates or Clinton, for example. Now, they put an emphasis on using science and professional training to bring order to a corrupt, chaotic society. So in this time period, money really talked in politics. In fact, it was not unheard of for, say, railroad companies, which would be the business equivalent of, say, modern pharmaceutical industries, or oil companies or banking interests that carry a lot of weight in modern politics. So it wasn't unheard of for railroad companies, for example, to basically purchase the campaigns of prominent state and national politicians, place them in office, and then expect them to protect their interests in office and not necessarily the interest of the electorate. So corruption, chaos. There was a lot of social unrest during this time period, as we'll see. And this is what they wanted to bring an end to, and to use their science, their technical skills, their expertise to do it. Now, one of the major figures within the progressive movement was a figure by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. He would become president from 1901 to 1909. And Theodore Roosevelt got his start early on as an adventurer. He went out west and worked on a ranch out there. During the Spanish-American War, he and some other affluent members of the Northeast formed a group of soldiers that went off to fight, known as the Rough Riders. They basically purchased their own fancy uniforms, styled on what cowboys in the West would have worn. They were a mounted cavalry unit, and kind of made a name for themselves in the sensationalist papers of their time. President Theodore Roosevelt actually came to office first not by winning an election, but actually as the vice president to William McKinley. And William McKinley was assassinated, and to the horror of the Republican Party, this very young, very radical, progressive that they feared came to power. And from there, he really made a name for himself as a trust buster. So Theodore Roosevelt, following his progressive ideals, began to target some of the major business organizations of his time. One of the first things that he targeted was were railroads. So in 1887, the federal government had created an Interstate Commerce Act that created the Interstate Commerce Commission. This body had the responsibility for regulating railroads, basically intra-border transportation networks. And the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 gave the federal government and gave the Interstate Commerce Commission the power to actually go in to investigate companies and then to bring them to court on charges of forming monopolies. And this was a great interest, or public interest of the time period. Because keep in mind, the very first trust, the very first major corporations were being formed during this time period. So you had some like Standard Oil, that was headed by John Rockefeller. That was a trust. So it was a small group of investors that came together under the leadership of John Rockefeller. They pooled their money together, and through horizontal integration, they managed to control the petroleum industry in the United States of America. So keep in mind, there are two different ways that a company could do this. There was horizontal integration, by which a company would go and they would buy out other companies that offered certain services, in this case, the refining and the distribution of petroleum, and thereby dominate a market. Another way that they could do this was through vertical integration, in which they basically sought to control the production of a good or service by monopolizing everything from the extraction of resources needed to provide that good or service, to its refinement, to its assembly in a plant, even to selling and to servicing said product. So what President Theodore Roosevelt did is he would go into these companies who would use the Interstate Commerce Commission He would use the federal government to start investigations and to place pressure on these companies. And once he placed sufficient pressure on them, what he would usually do is he would settle with them. They would agree to relinquish a certain amount of power, and in exchange, he would not bring down the full force of the government on them. So he wasn't necessarily an absolute enemy of big business. In fact, he very much liked big business. He saw it as a good thing. What he wanted was to make sure that these big companies allowed an even playing field for all parties involved and didn't gain too much power. So that was his major interest. In addition to that, he was an ardent conservationist. So this was one of two arms of the early environmentalist movement that we'll take a look at. But as the name sounds, he sought to conserve natural resources. So he was really the president that we associate with the creation of our early state parks and national monuments, especially when we talk about national monuments, natural national monuments, making sure that they would be around for the following generations to enjoy. There were some other progressive social policies that were passed under his administration. One was the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. Just to give you an example of how bad things were when they were completely unregulated, there was a young author by the name of Upton Sinclair who wrote a book called The Jungle, in which he described the conditions in the early meatpacking industry. Cleanliness was not an issue. Generally speaking, it was just producing as much meat as possible. So it was not unheard of for rancid meat or for rat excrement or other impurities to find their way into the meat supply chain and thereby pollute it, to contaminate it, and then to cause health issues for people who ingested it. Another kind of popular activity among some very unscrupulous individuals in this time was to sell what they used to call back then snake oil. So basically they would go out, they would peddle this magical elixir that was meant to cure snake bites, to protect against, say, smallpox. And on top of that, it could be used to polish revolvers or shine your shoes. So magical cure-all for everything. And usually they were not careful of what went into this material. In fact, if you go back and you take a look at some of these elixirs, they contain poisons, things that you just did not want to ingest. So some of these individuals were just outright uninterested whatsoever in the safety of people that consume these items. Some of the other remedies that were patented as drugs, as healthy drugs during this time period, were distributed by good-intentioned companies or individuals, but they really didn't have the science behind them to ensure that they were safe. So you can actually go back and look through old newspapers at some of the advertisements. And one thing that you'll find are advertisements, especially targeting women, for weight loss supplements. So today, some of your weight loss supplements would, not necessarily have FDA approval, but the companies that produce them still have to be careful of what they put in it, because they could face action in the courts that could cost them significant amount of money. And if criminal activities discovered, it could cost them jail time as well. And we saw this with some of our sports supplements, especially those that carried ephedrine during the early 2000s, when high school students that were taking these weight loss slash energy enhancing supplements were dying of cardiac arrest. So one of the dietary supplements that they used during this time period for women were tapeworms. And that is right. They would basically send women live small tapeworms. They would ingest them. Of course, they would lose weight. But as we know, even today, one of the big problems with tapeworms is getting it out of your system. And this is, something that they really didn't think through when they were marketing these things. So the Meat Inspection Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act, basically brought the federal government's power down on private interests and said, okay, there are certain standards that you have to meet. If you do not meet them, then you can face civil or criminal action within courts. And today, the FDA is still very much a major organization in American society that companies have to go through before they can even think about usually marketing medicinal products on the open market. Now, the last thing that the progressives had an interest in were in the conditions of working class people. And here we get into the issue of unions. So as these companies began to merge together and to form national corporations, workers began to also organize themselves and pool their resources together in the form of syndicates and unions and workers' interest groups. So the Gilded Age, the conglomeration of major business interests, this brought great wealth to individuals. So the first true millionaires in U.S. history emerged during this time period. You had the Vanderbilts, you had the Rockefellers, individuals that just lived immaculate lifestyles well above and beyond the means of the working class and the middle class individual. And during this period, a lot of the workers lived in basically squalor. So they didn't have a guaranteed 8-hour workday. They didn't have a guaranteed minimum wage. If they were injured on the job, that was their tough luck. The company usually did not carry any sort of workers' compensation, and it didn't carry any sort of responsibility for the individuals, for the workers that got injured on the job. So perhaps one of the worst instances of this was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in 1911. What had basically happened was in many cities, they were starting to build vertically. So, multiple stories high. This is the time period where we'll start to actually see steel as a construction component that allowed you to start to build what they called skyscrapers, especially when combined with the new invention of the elevator. So in the case of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, this was a textile shop located high on higher floors of a building. The owners paid their female workers a pittance. They would usually lock the door to make sure that the women workers didn't leave during the day without their permission. There were not sufficient fire escapes located on the exterior of the building. And so when a fire broke out, the fire department showed up, but their ladders were too short. The hoses could not reach that high up, and the firemen themselves couldn't get up there to save the women. So in horror, spectators stood and watched as these female workers would stand out on the edge of the ledge of the building and then jump off, preferring to fall to their desks or at least risk somehow surviving it to burning alive. So as workers started to unionize, the middle class, the wealthy, and politicians began to view them as a threat. In fact, they would usually refer to the working class as the dangerous classes. And they viewed these large gatherings of workers in these unions as not only a threat to their economic well-being, but a threat to the social hierarchy that was created amongst these classes. So many unions were banned within the workplace, and the federal government looked the other way while they did this. It was not unheard of private companies to purchase their own security, usually through the Pinkerton Detective Agency. And these security guards would be armed with everything from bludgeoning devices like batons to revolvers and rifles. And during showdowns, these private security companies, as we saw in the case of many mining strikes in the western states, would use lethal force with impunity. At other times, the local law enforcement agencies would join in to suppress these worker movements. So there was this massive fight between the working class and between the affluent people, as can be seen in the image on the right there. So there's a lot of social unrest as a result of this. And then we throw into the mix a new movement called the anarchists. And the anarchists basically wanted to free mankind by striking down all former rigid social structures that they viewed as propping up the affluent on the soldiers of the workers. But usually the anarchists, they were a very small group. Most workers would join what they called workers' associations, not necessarily unions, that prided hard work and self-reliance. Other workers in a smaller group were starting to join the Socialist Party that called for the for governments to own the means of production and to redistribute wealth to society equally. And then you have this small group of anarchists. But what anarchists would do is they would show up to these protests and to these strikes, and then they would try to turn it into a bloody revolution on the spot, usually by opening fire at police officers or by using bombs to just kind of spark violent conflict. And this is a pattern that we even see today. So if we take a look at, say, like the Black Lives Movement protests that came in the wake of George Floyd's death, or even earlier, say going back to the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle in the late 1990s, what usually happens is you have the majority of the people, just regular average individuals that see a social issue and want to resolve it, showing up to peacefully protest, but then groups of anarchists going in there and causing property damage, causing violence, and then of course this causes a reaction by law enforcement, a counter-reaction by the protesters, and what started as a peaceful protest on both sides becomes a major issue. So the unions during this time period, they were fighting for workers' rights, for example, an 8-hour workday, a minimum wage, some sort of protection on the job. But this would be a long-fought battle. So they would receive support of some progressives, but then you would have others like Theodore Roosevelt that really did not want to give much weight to this movement. So it would be a relative of Theodore Roosevelt's, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, during the Great Depression and the New Deal, that would finally give federal backing to unions. Now, in following Theodore Roosevelt's withdrawal from politics, he passed the baton to his successor and handpicked successor at that, William Howard Taft, expecting Taft to continue his trust-busting, his progressive politics, maintaining, his conservationist efforts in the West. But Taft really kind of proved to be more of a traditional politician who would side more with business interests than with progressive policies. So Theodore Roosevelt decided that he wanted to cut his safari expedition short. He had been in Africa with a massive train. In fact, one of the largest safari hunting parties recorded during this time period, just hunting any wild game that he could come across. Decided to cut it short, and in the election of 1912, we saw four major figures that would kind of determine which course the United States would follow from this point on. So it's considered to be one of those pivotal elections in U.S. history. And it was Woodrow Wilson versus Theodore Roosevelt versus Howard Taft and Eugene V. Debs. So William Howard Taft ran on, a pretty traditional Republican platform that emphasized, economic opportunities, constructing railroad and other transportation networks and across the United States. But as you can see here in the amount of votes that he received, he wasn't really one of the major candidates of his time. You also had Eugene V. Debs, who ran as the socialist presidential candidate, and he received almost 1 million votes, which for a socialist president in the United States of America, you got to give him some credit there. And Eugene V. Debs and the Socialist Party were growing in numbers at this time. So many workers frustrated that they weren't making much headway in workers' associations that emphasized traditional values of self-reliance and hard work and the American dream, were starting to join more radical groups like the Socialist Party that emphasized worker control of the government, worker control of the means of production, and the redistribution of wealth. Now, at the very top of the election, though, were the two major figures, Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt. So Woodrow Wilson was running as a Democrat and a progressive Democrat at that. And his platform was the New Freedom Platform, in which he called for limiting tariffs, which are taxes on imports. At this time period, tariffs were losing their popularity because it was recognized that when you use a tariff, what you're doing is you're taxing imported goods and with the goal in mind of artificially increasing their prices to make depressed domestic manufacturers more competitive. The problem is that based on the capitalist or theory of capitalism, produced by Adam Smith, that still is like the motivating factor in our economic system, this is counterproductive. Adam Smith was very emphatic on his support of competition between producers, because what eventually would happen is that the superior product would win out. The person that was not as efficient and did not produce as high of quality goods would eventually either have to change their model and make a better good, or they would go out of business. So they viewed competition as healthy. But at this time period, a lot of traditional politicians wanted to use the tariffs to promote U.S. business. But at the end of the day, it just simply meant that workers had to pay more for goods that they wanted. And usually it also meant that the quality of the good that they got was much, much lower. So Wilson ran on limited tariffs. He wanted a progressive income tax, which means that as you make more money, you pay more into it. And the idea here was to use taxes to support things like schools and road building, basically supporting federal expenditures that allowed the United States of America to be a major economic competitor. And then, of course, he supported trust busting. Now we take a look at Theodore Roosevelt, who ran on his own party platform, the Bull Moose, which was progressive. He also wanted limited tariffs, progressive income tax, and trust busting. And this was his platform known as New Nationalism. But with Theodore Roosevelt, what he was basically doing is he was running as what we would call today an independent. And as we've seen with other independents running during modern presidential elections, what usually happens is the independent pulls more from one party than the other. In this case, Theodore Roosevelt, as a former Republican, was really kind of drawing from the Republican Party's electoral base. So he ended up doing well, but really it was Woodrow Wilson that carried the day in the Electoral College and the popular vote. And so Woodrow Wilson came into power as the new progressive Democratic president. Now, please note that when I was listing this, a lot of the progressive platforms of this time period emphasized economic policy. Progressives did emphasize environmental policy. There were progressives that also were very much interested in social policies. A good example of this was Jane Addams, who was involved at the Hull House. And what the Hull House did is it tried to fight poverty by creating reform houses in poor neighborhoods that intended to teach women things like self-sufficiency, job skills, reading, language skills, as well as family planning, to allow women to control when they were going to have a family, because that would place a large drain on them economically, since women were considered to be primarily responsible for caring for the children in the home. And it would basically take her out of the workplace. So they wanted to give her more freedom reproductively, but also give her more skills in order to get better jobs. And there were similar programs that progressives followed, for example, on Native American reservations, where they tried to educate young Native American students in order to, as I said, give them economic opportunities. But you need to understand that ethnic rights, ethnic equality was far from the interest of many progressives. So in the case of Jane Addams and Margaret Sanger, yes, they tried to help poor neighborhoods. Yes, they tried to help poor women. But oftentimes, reproductive policies that progressives supported included things like forced sterilization. They wanted to limit the reproduction of these poor, what were usually immigrants and ethnic minorities, in order to combat, not only poverty, but more specifically, poverty that they linked to specific ethnic groups that were not given equality. So keep in mind, during this time period, you still had a large group of immigrants that were coming from Europe, but even though they were coming from Europe, they were oftentimes unwanted because many of them were coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. They didn't speak English like older immigrants did coming from Great Britain or Ireland. They weren't French or German, which among ethnic groups in the United States was viewed as more closely akin to the Anglo-Saxon or Teutonic races that were viewed as superior to other races. Today we reject these ideas, but back then they were largely held. So many of these immigrants were viewed as a social problem. In fact, many Italians and Greeks and Spaniards and other people from Southern Europe weren't even viewed as fully white. They were oftentimes viewed as tawny. That was the term that was, usually attributed to them. So if you ever go back and you take a look at political cartoons of this time period and how they portrayed Russian immigrants, Czech immigrants, Polish immigrants, Greek immigrants, Spanish immigrants, Jewish immigrants, or Italian immigrants, they would use physical, or they would accentuate physical characteristics meant to portray them as lesser than what were viewed as white ethnic groups. Likewise, during this time period, Asian immigrants were virtually banned from the United States of America. So Chinese and Japanese immigrants strictly forbidden. Filipino immigrants were allowed, but that was because the United States of America had a military presence in their islands, and as a result, were constitutionally obligated to allow them free entry. And that was true as well of Puerto Rican immigrants and Hawaiian immigrants. Keep in mind, Hawaii had just recently been conquered by the United States, but it wouldn't actually gain statehood until the mid-21st century. 20th century. And on Native American reservations, yes, they were trying to educate Native American children, but the way that they did this was usually by removing them, sometimes forcefully, from their families, shipping them to the east to schools like the Carlisle Institute, and there forcing the Native American children to choose Western European names, to dress like in a Western European style. And basically today, what we understand this to be, both at our national level as well as the international level, is essentially cultural genocide. So when you look at progressivism from the early 1900s, don't completely associate that with the progressive impulses that are alive today. So yes, you did have progressives like Theodore Roosevelt who believed that the quote-unquote white race was superior to all others. And then you also had progressive Democrats like Woodrow Wilson, who viewed African Americans as inferior in the South. He himself was a Southerner, who had no problem whatsoever with Jim Crow laws and segregation, and who was an ardent opponent of anti-lynching laws. Now, the last thing we want to look at in the progressive era is that of the roots of the modern environmental movement. So environmentalism is not something necessarily new to governments. There's been a long tradition of this. So if you look at farmers we oftentimes associate as natural environmentalists. They pretty much understand that if they overuse fertilizers, if they overgraze on a plot of land, if they overplant, if they don't rotate their crops, they can damage their soil. This isn't to say that farmers don't, overuse their land. We saw an example of this during the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. But generally speaking, the land is their moneymaker. It's what they produce their raw materials on, and they want to conserve it so that way they can continue to make their livelihood. Likewise, businesses do have an interest in, the environment. How far they go to protect it just depends on the business. So John D. Rockefeller, for example, when he was creating Standard Oil, one of the biggest things that he fought against early on was oil spills, wasting oil through, inefficient drilling practices, and it wasn't because he wanted to make sure that a certain bird species didn't go extinct or to keep the Great Plains, for example, pristine. He realized that if you drilled for oil in a certain way or transported oil in a certain way where oil spilled on the ground, that meant that he could not get that oil into someone's gas tank. And that's where he got his money, not from dumping it on the ground, but from getting it in someone's gas tank. Governments likewise have an interest and have long since had an interest in preserving certain aspects of the environment. So if you go back to the colonial era in U.S. history, the British government actually prohibited people from cutting down certain white pines. In fact, the British Royal Navy would go out there and mark certain white pine trees with symbols in the bark to, let people know, do not cut this tree down or you face, criminal charges. And it wasn't because the kings and queens of Great Britain necessarily thought that the white pine tree was beautiful and needed to be left in its natural state. It's because the white pine tree was a very sturdy tree, and it grew tall enough and was of the right material, buoyancy, weight, you name it, that they could use it as masts for their royal naval vessels. That is why they wanted to preserve them. Likewise, cities have long since had an interest in environmental concerns. So cities, for example, often suffered from a shortage of firewood the more and more that they became populated, because the heavy population would deforest the lands around the city, causing the city to have to pay more for firewood that was in construction material that had to be transported from further away. Water resources during the Progressive era, they wanted to make sure that water was clean water, was brought into cities and dirty water removed. And this was a legacy that they had inherited from the early 1800s when cholera broke out. And through the efforts of geographer John Snow, they discovered that dumping human offal in the streets led to polluting the water table beneath the streets. And this was problematic because polluted sewage water is perfect for the growth of the very deadly cholera disease. And they were basically drinking the very water that they were polluting, and that polluted water was giving rise to massive colonies of bacteria, or specifically cholera. So it's from these roots that two environmental movements began. One was conservationism, the other preservationism. So conservationism was championed by Theodore Roosevelt and by the Forestry Service during Theodore Roosevelt's administration. And conservation just simply said, look, we need to maintain resources for as long as we can. So, they withdrew certain lands from the extraction of resources to, preserve, to maintain or conserve the resources as long as possible. They did not allow lumber companies to just go in and cut without limitations forests down because they wanted those forests to regrow. So there were certain things that these companies had to adhere to, certain rules to conserve natural resources. On the other hand, you had figures like John Muir, who are preservationists. And here they advocated for the creation of national parks like the Yellowstone National Park, and they fought against the Hetch Hetchy Dam in California because they thought that certain natural wonders like Yosemite, like Yellowstone, should be left in their pristine state, environment untouched, because to them that was the greatest gift that they could give to the United States. And the United States has long since been associated with its landscape, with its environment. So if you look at the painting on the left, it's very much in the tradition of the Hudson River School. The Hudson River School was the very first truly artistic school to begin in the United States around the Hudson River in New York State. And the subject of their paintings was usually the landscape, what they viewed as the majestic wonder of the United States that was untouched. In this, they juxtaposed against European landscapes, which usually had been deforested or, turned under the plow or transformed into cities. So today you can still very much see these trends within the modern environmental movement as well. So the progressive movement is key to the 20th century in terms of, workers' rights. Who was going to fight for them? How could they fight for them? What would they look like? It would lay the foundation in the United States of America for modern business practices. So some of these bodies like the Interstate Railroad Commission, the FDA, live today. Americans' relationship to the government changed. The government was now viewed as something that could actively go out and not only protect the liberties of Americans, but also their health in the form of the Food and Drug Administration. And it also took a new role because in the past, the way that people usually supported the federal government and schools and other means was through property taxes or through tariffs. But now with the introduction of the progressive tariff, where people who had less money paid less and people that were wealthy paid more, is still alive and well in the United States of America. If you don't believe me, just wait until next April when you get ready to pay your taxes. So, crucial moment in government, crucial moment in politics, crucial moment in economy, and as well as environmentalism. Thank you for joining me. I hope you found this informative, and please visit me for the next topic. Thank you.